Human history, like a river, will keep moving forward with moments of both calm waters and huge waves.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
Your assistant?
Yeah. So, item. We need to have a conversation about the mood of the British Parliament, the bumps in the road ahead and whatnot.
I'm sorry, this situation here is this it? No offense, son, but you look like you should still be at school with your head down a fucking toilet.
Your first point there, the offense, I'm afraid I'm gonna have to take it. Your second point, I'm 22, but item, it's my birthday in 9 days, so to make you feel more comfortable, we could wait.
Don't get sarcastic with me, son. We bumped this tight ass city to the ground in 1814, and I'm all for doing it again. Starting with you frat fuck. I was led to believe I was attending the War Committee.
Yes, Assistant Secretary of State Linton Barrick asked me to brief you on the work of the Future Planning Committee.
I'm away.
This week on Multipolarity, something a bit different. We want to map the DC brain from the inside. Somewhere inside the Washington Beltway is an amorphous cabal of very smart people who often think alike, sometimes called the deep state, other times the blob, the permanent government, or even the swamp, be they ensconced in Foggy Bottom at the State Department, or at the Pentagon, CIA, other parts of the federal government, or at think tanks, or even at the New York Times and Washington Post. They have been tasked with projecting the global power of the world's greatest empire. They make decisions. Somebody has to. And just as France has its Enarques, or China has its unique mandarin examinations, the foreign policy bureaucracy of America have a common culture, a particular education, and a singular mindset. Yet it is so common, so super dominant in our Western world, we seldom think to question its priors. This week, to explore this subject, we're lucky enough to be joined by the very model of the modern wonk-general, Carlos Roa. Carlos is a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute and a contributing editor at the National Interest, an award-winning publication focusing on defense news, national security, military affairs and hardware, foreign policy and US politics, where Carlos was formerly executive editor. Previously, he was associate editor at Horizons, the Journal of International Relations and Sustainable Development. His research focuses primarily on geoeconomics, history, and the effects of technology on institutions and societal development. His writing has been published in Newsweek, Real Clear Politics, The Spectator, The National Interest, The American Interest, Quadrant Horizons, The American Conservative, and Asia Times, among others. We're going to use Carlos's experience of being an insider to chart the anthropology of the Washington deep state, to find out what it is to be part of the Washington power elite, how you get started, what schools you go to, what parties you go to, who you meet, and the fundamentals of the shared worldview they regurgitate to each other. So this episode is Rake's progress, if you will, how you get ahead in DC, who you need to step on, who you need to step around to get to the top of the greasy pole. We'll also talk about how the system actually works and where it's all gone wrong.
So, Carlos, you have the enviable role today of the Weberian ideal type of the DC insider. So I suppose we should start at the start, which is customary in Anglo-speaking countries. And maybe you could tell us how people get interested in becoming part of this collective, and possibly, where they get started, what schools they go to, and so on.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. To get right into the question, usually you need to be a weirdo. I mean, my experience was in high school, I was the kid who sat down in the library to read The Economist to see what's going on in Chad, or release political developments here and there, rather than going outside and playing football. But where things really take off is in university. And here, it's already, you're judged on where you went to. There's this notion that you can go to any university in the country and you can somehow leverage your way to DC, either in Congress or this and that. And to an extent, that's true. But for foreign policy, defense, intelligence, and all the deep state-ish fields, you're really judged if you went to a handful of schools with unique traits. These tend to be Georgetown School of Foreign Service, the George Washington Elliott School for International Affairs, the Fletcher School at Tufts University, the Princeton School of Public and National Affairs, so on and so forth. These institutions have various benefits that normal universities don't have. First is location, especially in Washington, D.C., because then they're close to the action. Some of your professors may be just adjuncts who doesn't sound that nice, but they're experienced and they're active now. My own experience, I went to Georgetown. I was taught, amongst others, by Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, a shall go unnamed professor who was a senior advisor to former Secretary of Defense under Reagan. And this is the funnest one, I was taught intelligence and technology by a former CIA officer who we learned 2 years ago actually ran the agency side of operation with Crypto AG, which was this whole thing where the CIA ran a nominally independent cryptography company that sold machines to third world countries, but it was actually a CIA front. So you have access to these people who teach you, but you start learning how they think, what the DC mentality is like. Very pro-United States, pro-unipolar order, and all that. They become your mentors, your teachers, they job references. On top of that, and you start being such as this whole elite culture way of thinking, these universities have all these resources and prestige that benefit your career. So you hang out with your peers at these various small clubs. At Georgetown, we had the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, the International Relations Club, and so on and so forth. So you're already in a tight group with your fellow, would-be future lead cadre, interacting and having seminars together, guest speakers, going to events, so on and so forth. So really, there is a shared culture in these elite schools of you being prepped, you have access to better than average courses, the rest of the country, the rest of universities, and it all builds into the same milieu of we're going to do this and advance our careers.
And what sort of background do people who go through this process come from? I mean, obviously they're going to these elite schools, but do they all come from very similar backgrounds, say upper middle class, have had parents in similar careers in the past, or is there more of a meritocratic selection process where people from a diversity of backgrounds, and by diversity I don't mean the modern sense of skin color or gender or sexuality. I mean the kind of the old-fashioned sense. I mean, do you get many bright kids from working class backgrounds going through this, or is it mostly people who are, I guess as we would say in Britain, to the manor born?
On average, I would say it's more to the manor born. There are a few cases of working class kids who work their way into institutions. They did well in school, right extracurriculars. They did well in the SAT, ACT tests, and so on. But when they get to these universities, this is where they start encountering the sort of cultural material barrier. Can you afford to go to these parties with your peers? Yes or no? Are you prepared for high-intensity examinations, how to write papers, and so on and so forth? And this is why you start noticing in some institutions, kids who drop out, because if they can't afford it, they have to get scholarships. They can't meet the scholarship requirements, then they tail down their ambition. So on average, they tend to be more upper middle class or upper class students. So there really is a tendency towards groupthink because of this.
And would you say, just very quickly, that the disproportionate number of them are actually from the kind of DC, Baltimore area, the Beltway, as it were, or from families that are from there?
I don't know that for sure, but if they're in the DC schools, the Georgetown, George Washington, Johns Hopkins SAIS, etc., I would say like a third or good amount of them tend to be from the area. Usually because their parents either did international affairs or some adjacent field.
Okay, so then in the universities themselves, like what sort of things are being taught? I mean, you've obviously said that you've very much so clearly formulated what the milieu is and how the kind of lore and so on is passed down. But what are people actually being taught? Are they being taught macroeconomics? Are they being taught international relations? What's the deal?
Generally, they'll get they'll get the basics, introduction to international relations, macroeconomics, comparative politics. But then at some point, usually around later sophomore year, early junior year, you need to start specializing. So you have to have a good foreign language, especially when you do foreign policy or strategy, technology, so forth. So it really depends on what you want to do. But in these schools, you have, due to the availability of resources and professors, the leeway to do whatever you want. So you went to Russian foreign policy as a class, you can do that, or the foreign politics and foreign policy is Soviet Union, that's an option. Middle Eastern comparative political systems, that's an option. Vast array of options. So really, you have the chance and opportunity to specialize in what you want. And these tend to be taught by former officials or former specialists who know what they're doing, or are still actually involved in these fields.
So once you've gone through the kind of the college process and the postgrad college process, and you've attended the right parties and shown that you have the right level of verbal acuity and are able to say the right things and to amuse the right people, what are the next steps for the aspiring member of the deep state? Where do they go after that? Are we talking about think tanks? Are we talking about being the kind of the advisor to a congressman who sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee? Are we talking about kind of a special advisor who sits and runs sub-Saharan Africa for the CIA? Where do they go and how does it work out?
The way I like to describe it is, in practice, DC works like a modern day extension of the medieval guild system. In that, you start as a young apprentice, you're assigned to study under a master, you do, part of my language, when you sort of the shit detail, you run his coffee, you help sum up his notes, help write an article with him, this and that. And the key factor is you're learning at this official or experienced official's feet. Like, he was former, let's say, envoy to sub-Saharan Africa, etc. And now you're helping coordinate his meetings, do basic research for an article he wants to do, etc. And you start learning through this. So this process can be done in think tanks, which is the average case, but also whether in government, journalism, whichever field. What really matters is under who are you working with and are you learning stuff? And in that capacity, what are you doing outside of the job? Are you attending fellowships? Are you going to the right parties, networking? For example, here's just a general, suggested course. Let's say you finish school and you somehow manage to get a good fellowship. For example, the Herbert Scoville Jr. Peace Fellowship, which puts you for 6 to 9 months at a think tank of more or less your choice. You can swing it. There you work under a senior fellow or senior scholar, gain more experience on, let's say, you're doing China policy. And from there, with this on your brain, you can apply to another think tank as a research assistant. Then next few years, you write an article, this and that, here, get published, promote to research associate, and you start getting a better idea of how things actually work.
Right. So I guess it's like, whenever I watch any US TV drama that involves the law, there's always some bright young thing who's being interviewed, and it turns out that they interned under ex-Supreme Court Justice. And that's a kind of something that's impressive on the CV. And it's and what you're saying is it's the same when it comes to the foreign policy, kind of permanent foreign policy state within Washington, that you kind of intern under these individuals. And as you're interning, you're not just gaining experience from that, you're also doing a range of fellowships or other activities. And at the same time, you're building a network. You're going to lunch with the right people. You're attending parties, or you're frantically seeking invite to the right parties. And at the same time, and through all that, you're building a kind of a body of experience the right kind of connections to leverage that experience. And also you have, to a certain degree, the patronage of somebody who's already experienced within the system.
That's very much the case. And I kind of need to emphasize this. If you really want to do foreign policy, defense, and security, the whole thing, you're either writing or you're improving your writing. Part of this is because Washington, D.C. is not, it's a town of a few million, et cetera. But when it comes to decision making and influencing policy, it really is only a few thousand, a few 10,000 individuals. And they all read each other or see each other and so forth. So if you can get your article, let's say you write a good article or essay and it gets into Foreign Policy Magazine, National Interest, Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, etc., the odds of you being read by a fellow person in policymaking or from policy analysis is pretty high. So what happens is over time, you start seeing people who really start believing, and this is part of the DC mentality, that reality can be shaped just by what they write. Because let's say their idea gets pushed far enough, next thing you know, it's policy. Some policymaker adopted it. So there comes to this latent belief that governing becomes just the correct manipulation of words. And you can manipulate words in just the right way and get them to appear in just the right place, you're affecting reality itself.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because that's kind of one of the things that I've sensed. That, of course, it's never been said explicitly, but it's one of the things that I've felt with regards to the way that Washington, D.C. has operated in the last, 22 months since the beginning of 2022 or even the end of 2019 is, a sense that really what counts is the narrative rather than reality. It's how we explain the narrative. But I wonder that, within the process of studying at these schools, which are, they're not just elite, they're very kind of specific and very focused on a specific area. So within studying at those, but especially the kind of the apprenticeship process that you have just explained, how much space is there for intellectual diversity? For instance, if you're a student and after studying foreign affairs or international relations or some facet of that, if you come to view the world through a realist framework, if that's how you start viewing the world in events and start kind of projecting into the future or forecasting the future, how much room is there for that? And would somebody like that be able to secure an internship or get into the apprenticeship process? Or is it very much a self-selecting process where kind of liberal universalists or liberal interventionists or neoconservatives, whatever we want to call them, do they self-select for people who see the world like they do? Or do the students start kind of viewing the world like that because they know it's the only way to get ahead in their chosen field?
So this is funny because the National Interest is probably the main realist publication in town, and I'm a realist, so I had to go through this entire process myself. On average, it's more the latter case that you described, which is students start tailoring their views to the views of the system or superiors and institutions, and from there, institutions kind of pick and choose. But part of this is because of the career and economic incentives of how the entire thing works, which is DC, at the end of the day, despite pretensions otherwise, has a limited amount of resources and a limited amount of attention to dedicate to the entire world of issues. You look at it right now, we have the war in Ukraine, the Israel-Gaza situation, Taiwan in the background, the recent flare-up in Guyana, and all these other issues. Policymakers in DC, the White House Situation Room, etc., cannot dedicate the same amount of resources and attention to all these issues. So there is an incentive in, if you were a policy analyst, wonk, whatever, you were incentivized to really sell your pet cause, even if you do inflate the threat, because that way you get more attention to your cause, to your career path.
So I guess the question that comes to my mind when I hear about the kind of structure, which doesn't wholly surprise me, having followed some of these publications, is that what you're describing sounds like it's actually quite resistant to change. Because if you publish something in one of these publications that's way out of left field and isn't in keeping with the rest of the narrative, it'll be like a Martian or something landing and trying to speak Martian. People just won't comprehend it. Is that the case, or is kind of out of the box thinking respected?
To address the first half, usually yes. If you do out of the box thinking, people aren't dumb. They understand where you're coming from, but the issue is it attacks the various incentives and the status quo. For example, there's an article that kind of got a lot of buzz in 2021. It was called, this is a very provocative title, "Give the U.S. Navy the Army's Money." Now, the basic argument was, if we're going to focus on China, then China, this is mostly a maritime issue. We need to focus on the Navy, get more submarines and ships. It's not going to be any use to have a Bradley tank, or this amount of Bradley tanks when fighting China. What happened? Suddenly, you have all these Army individual officers in the Pentagon or a think tank say, you can't say that. We need the Army for XYZ reasons. Similar, you have all these congressmen say, you can't cut the Army, we need it for XYZ reasons. Those congressmen may have factories or whatever, special interests within their districts, or they receive money from defense contractors who also don't want to see whatever weapon platforms be cut. So if you propose a certain reform, you need to be prepared to receive the fury of all the various interests, node of power, or entrenched bureaucracies that exist to support that interest.
Yeah, funnily enough, actually, I wrote an essay on material, economic value of material for American affairs, and I did notice that new people were appearing on my Twitter who seemed to have a very set interest in maintaining the U.S. Navy. So, what would you see as the mix of forces there? Obviously, we could almost say that it's kind of Marx versus Hegel in a way. That are the ideas dominating, or really is the incentive structure just completely overpowering the ideas?
My view is the incentive structure works or is overpowering the ideas more often than not. To give another example, the foremost realists in DC these days, like senior most, are the guys over at the Marathon Initiative, which is a think tank co-run by Elbridge Colby and A. Wes Mitchell. Colby's grandfather was CIA director. He himself is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. He helped lead the writing of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. So literally, what is the U.S. military's strategy for defense? As for Mitchell, former Assistant Secretary of State for European Eurasian Affairs and the author of, I think it was, The Grand Strategy of the Habsburg Empire. So quite literally, the expert in how the Austro-Hungarian Empire worked, i.e. an empire that's cash-strapped, military surrounded by rivals on all sides, multicultural empires, and used to do diplomacy to survive. So these guys are the smartest in town, the foremost realist advocates in town. But even then, you notice that when they argue in public, they have to carefully tailor their words to not upset people, because they themselves have clear aspirations. They want to be Secretary of Defense and this and that. And you can't jeopardize your confirmation hearing before the Senate if you start saying things like, we need to cut the military by X amount. More specific example, Wes Mitchell recently wrote an article called, quote, "America's a heartbeat away from a war could lose," which, sounds pretty sensible. Military's overstretched. But then you start getting into the actual word of the article and you start seeing things that just don't make sense. He says, if China attacked Taiwan, the U.S. would be hard-pressed to rebuff the attack while supporting Ukraine and Israel. Then he says, this is not because the U.S. is in decline. Now, wait a second. We're in an environment where we see, even in the news headlines, the industrial base is weak. We can't support Ukraine with artillery. We have less money than we did. So how can you not say the U.S. is in decline? Or even further down in the article, you start seeing we need to increase the military budget. With what money? We already have inflation. We need to support all these other things, etc. Where's money going to come from? And you realize they're phrasing these articles this way because they need to defend their own position and their own interest in the long term. You can't say it out loud, we need to cut the military by half to support our current material conditions and the reality in front of us. Doing that would endanger their own positions. And this is just one example, but this dynamic exists throughout any realist you see in DC.
Stepping point to get to the point at which our deep state careerists. So I think that's a good reaches real power. So we've moved from university through the apprenticeship process to progressing through the kind of like the think tank industrial complex. Let's move on to real power. You mentioned, congressional confirmation hearings. I think that's something that perhaps certainly people in Britain, but listeners elsewhere in the world might not grasp as an important part of the career of, say, a career diplomat or national security advisor or anybody in the international relations and trade sectors within the US federal government. Because, of course, in Britain, we have a permanent professional civil service and our ministers are just chosen, right? There's no confirmation hearings. Whereas in the United States, you don't have such a, a lot of your kind of civil service in inverted commas or kind of state bureaucracy jobs are actually appointees by the sitting president. And those appointees have to go through congressional hearings where they're cross-examined by senators. So do you want to just kind of explain that process, explain how their past and history affects those hearings and therefore their ability to get a job in kind of real power in inverted commas and the sort of areas into which they move?
There is, the permanent bureaucracy in these various institutions, departments, etc. But usually the senior positions or the advisors to senior positions tend to be appointed by Congress. And there are, I believe it's over 9,000 positions. There's actually every 4 years, there's a whole document that kind of lists out the entire everything called the Plum Book, Plum. And getting appointed, it again says depends upon congressional appointee, and being approved means you need to negotiate, you need to have a political career pass that can meet expectations. You didn't say anything or do anything radical. If you did, you can defend it in some way or other. And you need to have good relations with congressmen, senators, etc., or have these be managed on your behalf by the administration or others. So really, if you want to be a senior-most official, you have a clean nose, clean background, you didn't raise too much of a fuss, and you have strong political backing. So this creates an environment where you really don't want to rock the boat too much, because you don't want to have that one congressman whose district has so-and-so whatever be coming after you.
And would that be coming after you based on maybe a position that you took in a foreign policy article somewhere, or on a kind of a personal political basis?
Any or above. That's the issue.
So really it is kind of a liability then to publish anything controversial if you aim at a higher status in effect.
Pretty much, yes. If you are senior enough, important enough, you have some, room to finagle, but otherwise you take a risk if you go really out of bounds.
No, I was just going to say, to put this into language that perhaps people can understand because it's current. If you were at a think tank which hugely criticized the current administration's Ukraine policy, and if you published a paper or maybe an op-ed in the Washington Post or produced a paper at a think tank that really kind of went after that policy, in 2 or 3 years you could have Lindsey Graham coming after you at a congressional appointment hearing, right?
Pretty much, yes. It all also depends on the context. If the Ukraine war is still ongoing, in 3 years, then they'll come after you for being defeatist or potentially a Russian sympathizer, or you say things about the budget's not true, etc. If the war ends a certain way, they can probably try to argue well, actually I was right, and you defend it in that case. So it depends also on the context. But really, because of this, on average, you want to have your back covered. So the incentives for causing a fuss and asking deep questions of concerns, they're not aligned with with your career.
Just to circle back slightly on what we've already discussed, Is this made clear to people even when they're at university, or do they kind of just get it from watching the process?
It's a mix of you get it from watching the process, or you're told by someone, not exactly specifically told, but kind of like hinted, hey, you shouldn't say that something because that might affect this and that. But it's never formally stated. It's much of a culture. You kind of start realizing how it works just from watching what everyone else is doing. It's also just the economics of how things work. For example, let's say you are a junior staff guy focusing on, we specialize in Middle East counterterrorism, insurgency stuff. You raise some challenging views, and suddenly, let's say ISIS is defeated, and a few years later, the Afghan withdrawal, and now there's much less of a need for all these counterterrorism experts. So fewer jobs, and you can't find one. What do? Well, after a certain time of job searching, you bite the bullet and accept a less prestigious post at a defense contractor as a technical analyst or a translator and so on, which it's a job, but you're out of the game. You're now stuck in a medium low prestige job and you want to get back in.
Speaking of how the system works, I think this is a really good time to move from the kind of the career process where you have expensively educated, motivated young people who gain some expertise through education, gain more expertise and, more importantly, a network and patronage through an apprenticeship process and climbing onto the career ladder. And then eventually these people move into various forms of political power or gain more power and seniority within the think tank system, or perhaps even within various parts of the intelligence community or elsewhere in the federal government. But I think,
or you cycle back out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's an important point that we need to cover, because I think when people look at the way that DC works, or let's say when I look at the way that DC works from a position of a fair degree of ignorance, I see something where I get an impression of how this whole system works, and it's quite amorphous, quite nebulous, and it's very much multimodal. There are multiple points of power within the system, and each of those points might have individual kind of power structures within them. And as we said right at the top of the show when we were introducing it, it covers not just kind of political appointees within the federal government. It doesn't just cover kind of at the top secretaries of state and presidents, but it also covers other federal employees, whether it be at the CIA or the NSA or various parts of the defense sector, the Pentagon or the defense intelligence. But it also covers things like think tanks. It covers things like journalists at some of the newspapers of record, like the Washington Post and the New York Times. And this seems to be very much a network, and the people there seem to be quite interchangeable. One day you could be a speechwriter on foreign policy for the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor. The next day you could be running your own think tank. The next day you could be, writing op-eds for the New York Times. And then the next day you could be, National Security Advisor yourself, right? It's a kind of, it's very much a revolving door. Certainly we saw that during 2008, 2009 in the global financial crisis, and the revolving door between government, the regulatory authorities, and the investment banks. But how does that work within the foreign policy and trade policy structure that we're discussing this evening, Carlos?
It really is a case of when you're in government, you must execute policy, or implement policies already been formulated. When you're out of government, that's your chance to, apart from if you need to make some money, et cetera, you go in business and so forth. But it's also a chance to refine policy, prepare policy for the next administration, or prepare your job for the next administration. So to give an example, I think the best way to see this is the Democratic Party when they were outside of power during the first Trump administration. This is where you start seeing all the kind of people doing 180s on policy. For example, we had at that point we had Jake Sullivan, who is now He's now a national security advisor. He wrote an article saying America needs a new economic philosophy. Foreign policy experts can help. And this sort of starts laying the foundations, article-wise, for what becomes the foreign policy for the middle class of the Biden administration. Or, for example, in 2018, you had Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner, who were at that point former Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific Affairs, and Ratner was Deputy National Security Advisor for Vice President Joe Biden. There wrote an article that basically said, hey, we were wrong in China. This is what we need to do going on from here on out. And now they're back in power. And now Campbell is the NSC coordinator for Indo-Pacific, i.e. the White House Asia SAR. And Ratner is Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Affairs. So being out of government is a chance to reformulate policy, prepare for the next administration, whether it be in think tanks, journalism, or universities.
But of course, that policy that you're formulating outside of government presumably is subject to the same constraints that you described earlier when you were saying about, writing articles and anticipating for the future congressional hearing that you might get in trouble for, right? I mean, there has to be some constraints around Jake Sullivan going out and reformulating China policy, which was obviously a huge shift, one of the biggest that we've seen. Maybe you could say something about those constraints, and maybe actually an interesting example would be Jake Sullivan redoing China policy, which was massive. Like what physically changed there that allowed such a huge about face on policy?
So this is where it gets kind of the weird game of, is it okay to say something? Since this isn't like, let's say, China, where you have the CCP puts out the Kishu Journal, which is the sort of official party journal on electoral doctrine. In DC, so this is the official deep state line on this and that. It's a mixed game of signals and tells of who is saying what, how is it received, and does it make sense given the current context? Doing a 180 in China makes much more sense when you have Donald Trump go out and take the brunt of the fire for saying, hey, we need to be tough on China now. And then Xi Jinping changed the Chinese constitution to say, I'm going to be in charge from here on out. So at that point, start realizing, okay, the China as a responsible stakeholder model, this doesn't seem to be working. We already have the guy in the White House pushing this ahead of us. So let's just, run with where we're going, we're seeing with, and now it's allowed to change tack. We're seeing a level of this in practice right now with, say, industrial policy and economics, which Philip can comment a lot on. We're seeing the Biden administration go all in on protectionism, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is more or less the Green New Deal in disguise. And we even see hints here and there of preparing for what comes next. For example, we had a think tank, I think it was the Center for New American Studies. The Center for New American Security, which is possibly the most defense industry friendly think tank in town, start putting out all these reports and essays on industrial policy and the defense space, which a few years ago didn't do at all. But with the increasing recognition of, hey, this is important, they start putting it out. You read through the reports, they're fine, but you start seeing the recommendations. One of these reports, for example, says we need to appoint a new Deputy National Security Advisor for Technology Competition, or, and this is the actual wording, we need to, quote, establish a cadre of U.S. tech diplomats. So you start seeing they're putting out reports, preparing for, a trend, that's going in a certain direction, saying, hey, we need more jobs on this or that sector.
So this actually makes a lot of sense when we talk about the fact, as you just alluded to, that, and we've talked about it on the show before, that the IRA is at least partly the Green New Deal wearing new clothes. And of course, that's because, as you say, these kind of whispers build and so on, and you're taking the path of least resistance. So if you want to get the Inflation Reduction Act done, you kind of put your finger to the wind, you lick your finger and put it to the wind, and you say, geez, this green thing is really big, and there's a lot of people over there salivating over potential tax subsidies and so on that's a pretty, simple, straightforward path. Whereas going down the hardcore manufacturing route, you don't have the same kind of structure in place, right?
The key thing to understand, I think this has been, the theme of this whole podcast, when I talked about this episode, is DC is not a monolithic structure. It's a confederation of various tribes and war bands, so to speak, of various interest groups who don't all have, no one has the power to do everything by themselves. So it's a lot of ad hoc coalitions to get things done. We need, to deal with the foreign policy, weak industrial base, economic problems, etc. So, hey, let's get the Greens together with the policy. We need to address inflation, guys, and all these other little interest groups and pass this reform together. But because it's such a large system with so many various interest groups and entrenched interests, it's much easier to veto stuff, say this is no good, we can't do this, we can't do that, than actually passing things.
I want to ask about how things actually do get done, because, of course, actually one of the things that kind of Philip has helped me a lot with is kind of understanding that fact within DC is that, it's not a monolithic creature, so to speak. It's as you say, a kind of confederation of competing and sometimes ad hoc allied factions and power structures. But how do things actually get done? So, have people in government, and when they go out of government, they use that time to kind of research and build policy ideas, which then in turn, when their party or when the next government gets into power, they can use to get themselves back into the seats of power. But I assume that there needs to be more than that to get policy through. You've got to push it through Congress to begin with. But I assume then that Congress or congressmen and women are themselves advised by the very same people or people who come through the very same kind of think tank, former government advisor or former administration advisor, former member of the federal government itself. So they're kind of advised by like-minded people, and therefore, policy tends to fit nicely, but also there are backdoor connections that kind of short circuit, say, the link between president and, congressional leader, and they can go, from special advisor to special advisor. Would that kind of be an accurate way of looking at the way things get done?
That's pretty much there on point. Yeah. So you have people like, I won't name a name, but a certain, say, a think tank policy analyst who helped write one of these reports, then gets a job as so-and-so senator's senior policy advisor for this and that. And he brings with him the report, just around the office, and say, hey, we should, advance this for this and that reason. Or this individual meets, with his fellow former coworkers at social party, either an official party or with another, third party grouping, and they share ideas there. So since the number of people who actually think about policy in a deep way, write out these papers, etc., is relatively small, especially given whatever topic, whether it be China policy or industrial policy or military force structure stuff. It's a small world in each case, so you tend to get around, know people, and know what each of those policies are.
So I want to talk about something that we haven't covered so far. One aspect of this whole kind of amorphous network that we haven't covered yet, which for Britain certainly is quite a new phenomenon, but I think is a little bit older within the United States itself. You have a longer history of philanthropy and connections between philanthropists and governments. But in Britain, a excellent political journalist called Tom McTague recently investigated and profiled the Tony Blair Institute, which was founded by our former Prime Minister Tony Blair. And, it's quite interesting in terms of what it does. It's quite something of a black box, but apparently what they do is they provide both pro bono and purchased policy advice, in addition to their straight charity work, which is the sort of stuff that we would tend to associate with charity work. They also offer this kind of policy service, which is sometimes pro bono, sometimes actually paid for by governments, which really tries to help governments in the third world produce, as they call it, good policy. Okay, so you get all of these. It's a kind of a think tank that actually kind of sells its service at a very high level to governments in the global south, as far as I can understand, or in the world of emerging economies. You also have the kind of the Bill and Hillary Clinton Foundation, very famously, and there's also the George Soros. I forget the name. Open something. I forget the name. You
Open
probably
Society
know,
Foundation, I think it
Carlos.
is.
Yeah, Open Society Foundations. That's right. What role do these play? Because these seem like kind of think tanks on steroids. They're not just kind of producing policy papers to circulate around kind of the Beltway in Washington or SW1 in London or in Brussels. These guys are at the kind of the coalface. They're shaping literal legislative agendas for entire countries. But they also have the same people from these same schools and have done the same apprenticeships from Washington and London and other places as well. And also former members of government. Recently resigned Prime Minister of Finland recently joined the Tony Blair Institute. So what role do these organizations play both in the setting of policy in Washington, but also Washington's ability to project its preferred policy around the world?
So this is, where it gets really spicy, and I can get in trouble for this stuff. And funnily enough, I have a Tony Blair Institute story, actually.
Nobody's listening, Carlos. It's just you and Philip and I. Just tell us everything.
I know. Actually, I'll tell you the Tony Blair story since I was there to see it firsthand. So one of my first jobs out of college was being in Belgrade for 2 years, working for a former UN General Assembly president. And in Belgrade, the government at the time hired the Tony Blair Institute to help, hey, how do we advance our economy, modernize it? So what they came back with from Tony Blair Institute was we should knock down this neighborhood in Belgrade to make the Belgrade waterfront. So this was a whole idea the Tony Blair people sold to the government in Serbia. And they said, hey, you're going to knock down this whole neighborhood to build this, huge, Dubai-esque like neighborhood of glass, new glass buildings, etc. For rich expats. Let me introduce you to the builders of Dubai. So now you have Tony Blair, mediating between the government in Serbia and UAE, developers to help build this entire thing. And then this led to, among other things, you can look this up, the questionable demolition of this waterfront, the pre-existing buildings. By questionable, I mean midnight demolitions by men in baklavas, etc. These are, as you said, kind of super think tanks that go the next step by saying, hey, we have the connections and ability to actually make a lot of policies pass through and influence things at macro scale. I think the best way to understand this, especially since a lot of it's derived from U.S. policy power, is to draw an example from, have you ever seen I think it's the HBO series Rome?
I have not. Philip might have, though.
No, but just pretend we have.
There is one brief episode where Herod, Tetrarch of Galilee, comes to Rome to speak to Mark Antony and says, I hear you, Roman gentlemen, you don't take bribes, absolutely not, but you do take gifts of gold, right? Yes, that's the case. Well, I'll give you a substantial gift of gold, and in exchange, you can help me secure, Judea and handle, local problems. And Mark Antony says, all right, just one rule, you need to keep you Jews and Judea in line. Okay. And then Mark Antony says, well, congratulations, Herod. You now have the full backing of Rome. To an extent, that also happens in the super think tank world, where you have senior political figures or senior policy figures, etc., with a lot of influence say, hey, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, a generous donation to our cause, and we can help make things happen. We had the president of Brookings, one of the major DC think tanks, get in trouble because it turns out he got a few million from Qatar, for example. And he was trying to facilitate meetings that shouldn't be happening.
Well, I'm glad to hear that the think tanks run by our imperial governors are purely in it for the common good. But just to go back to the DC structure in a sense, so what you described, I think, is a very static system. It's one that changes very slowly. It's one that is very kind of a collective intelligence in a way, because we have all these kind of nodal points meeting with each other and making marriages of convenience and so on. But I think maybe it would be worthwhile you explaining what happens when an outside interruptive force comes into that. So maybe we could think about two of those. Number one is potentially a disruptive president in the executive branch. Of course, America has had no disruptive president in the executive branch in living memory. I'm talking about Trump, obviously. And the second, perhaps, that we might consider as a disruptive outside force is a surprise war. Again, a situation that we definitely haven't seen recently. So just maybe to kind of get what happens when you shake the nest a little bit with those two external forces.
You've been alive the past few years. You kind of saw what happens. You have complete resistance and kind of a shock response and trying to adjust. However, in the first case, there's an issue because you run into the problem of personnel. Yes, you can have a disruptive president, in charge now, but you don't have the same number of, personnel professionals to fill all the slots that think like the disruptive president or leader. I mean, yes, you can have Donald Trump, and is in charge, for example, but who's going to run national security? Who's going to run as ambassador of, to China? Who's going to do this and that in the NSC? And at that point, you kind of realize, there is a distinct lack of unorthodox thinkers who do policy and all this. So you're forced to rely on a good amount of the people who are already there. So this is why a lot of the policies, can get stymied, which is why Trump, despite, coming with this mandate to do a lot of change, can't execute a lot of it because he has to, there isn't a choice, appoint a number of people who are already establishment, oriented or thinking, or the experts on hand. As for an outside, let's say, crisis, like a surprise war, it's an attempt to adjust quickly, but again, it depends on the context of the war. Can it actually be sustained? If so, they'll try. If it can't, a lot of panicking going around.
But presumably it would trigger the interest sectors that are dealing with that war. So very famously, I don't think we're telling our readers and our listeners anything, but Victoria Nuland was one of the main players in Central and Eastern Europe, and she was promoted after the Ukraine war. I mean, I assume we see a little bit of that going on too, right?
We see a little bit of that, yes, but this is the weird thing about our current moment, which is the shocks and the number of shocks and the intensity of shocks are coming in so quickly for DC. It's kind of running out of the bandwidth to address them. And this is not conspiracy. We have, I think it was an Axios, the favorite news outlet / newsletter for DC, saying the people in the White House Situation Room cannot keep up with the multiplicity of crises coming in.
I actually read that, and I found that quite scary because that's when people start doing stupid things, and that was before the Venezuela-Guyana situation, right?
Correct. So this is the interesting about the emerging multipolar environment, which is DC is being forced to confront with the fact that it does not have endless resources or attention to address with all the fissures emerging in the current system. So it's kind of a headless chicken. What do we do? Just try to throw more money at it. That always works, right?
So that's really a very good explanation for why, I mean, obviously we're quite critical on the podcast, but I'll be frank. I mean, I see a lot of irrational, poor decision-making going on in DC. Not saying that that's never been there before. We can all pick apart the Iraq War. We can all pick apart the Vietnam War. But the level of kind of disorientation at the moment seems intense. And you're saying because there's a fairly static system that's used to a very gradual process being hit with multiple shocks because the world is changing really fast.
Exactly. Not only that, but also since DC is, let's be frank, a mostly baby boomer run town, they have a very entrenched, this is how it's always been mentality that isn't open to radical change. And they still believe at a certain level. I mean, look, if you grew up in the period of American affluence, when you're making a lot, when the country is getting richer and richer, you're not going to be open, or you're going to be the idea that, America's now much poorer, our industrial base is substantially weaker, et cetera. So there's still a lot of thinking coming from position of, we have the money, the resources, the bottomless pit, pot of money to adjust whatever comes our way. And they're kind of starting to realize, no, we don't. We need to print money in order to do this and this. We need to print money to pass all these COVID measures, the IRA, and suddenly we have inflation, and how do we deal with this? Print more money. So it's a lack of awareness of how much things have changed, not just in the international context, but also the domestic context, and unable to really, really grasp that we don't have the same resource base in terms of capital, active resources, industrial base, et cetera, to address problems that we did before. So it's sort of a, why isn't this working? This usually always works. Now it doesn't, because we don't have the same amount of resources we did before.
Christ. Yeah. What did we learn, Palmer?
I don't know, sir.
I don't fucking know either. I guess we learned not to do it again.
Yes, sir.
I'm fucked if I know what we did.
Yes, sir. It's hard to say.
Jesus fucking Christ.
Thank you for listening to this extended edition of Multipolarity. As 2024 closes, we're taking some time off, but we'll be back early in the new year with a Crystal Ball special. If you're on the Patreon list, we've got another half hour of Carlos Roa behind the velvet rope. If not, we'd like to thank you for listening to us in our first year of operation. Multipolarity has had a big 12 months. The concept spent 2023 forcing its way into the front of the world's newspapers, and we like to think Multipolarity, the podcast, has been upstream of that debate, helping to establish its terms. For now, Merry Christmas and a Happy New World Order.